On the Nature of Things, from Omnibus 4. Ancient philosophy is sometimes very hard to follow, detached as it is from everyday life. No one has ever seen one of Plato's forms, the eternal intellectual objects that Plato believed were more real than the sensible objects that we bump into every day. Aristotle said that everything is a combination of two realities, form and matter. Matter by itself has no shape, color, no properties of any kind, and form is even more elusive. Since what we actually see, taste, touch, and hear is always something that is formed matter, why even make the distinction between form and matter? What difference does it make? In fact, ancient philosophers were all after one main thing. They wanted to know how to live well. As the historian Pierre Hadot noted, ancient philosophy was not a collection of ideas, but rather a choice of a way of life. All the difficult words and highfalutin concepts are ways of explaining and defending the way of life that the philosopher chooses to follow. Modern philosophy students often think of Plato and Aristotle and all the rest as people who taught certain ideas. But for the philosophers themselves, philosophy was more like a religion, a pathway leading to wisdom. Epicurus, the philosopher who inspired the work of Lucretius, certainly saw things that way. He did have elaborate scientific beliefs about the world, but the point of those beliefs was to explain how we are to live. The study of nature, he wrote, aims to produce, quote, men who are strong and self-sufficient and who take pride in their own personal qualities and not in those that depend on external circumstances. Epicurus and Lucretius both developed theories about the world, but the goal was to form a certain kind of human being. Ancient philosophers were wrong about many things, but did get this one thing right. Our beliefs about the world shape the life we lead. For the Christian, the world is, above all, a surprising, overwhelmingly good gift, a gift that we have done nothing to earn or deserve. The very fact that you and I are alive at all is a gift. God gave us the gift of life when we didn't even exist to receive that gift. Every thought, every new dawn, every sight and sound, every other person, every book we read, and every meal we eat, it is all gift from top to bottom. If this is what the world is, then the only proper way of life is the way of gratitude. And if Jesus has risen from the dead, then we will live and die in the light of that triumph. On the other hand, if we think, as Epicurus and Lucretius did, that the gods take little notice of human beings, we will take little notice of them. If we think that our souls die with our bodies, then we are going to live and die in a particular way. On the Nature of Things is all about that way of death and life. General information, author and context. The world into which Titus Lucretius Carus was born around 99 BC was a chaotic one. The Roman Republic was in shambles, and there was not yet a Julius Caesar or an Octavian to take the reins of power and bring the bolting horse to rest. Roman virtues, patriotism, justice, loyalty, self-control were collapsing as well. Soldiers no longer felt loyalty to Rome, but swore allegiance to the strong man of their choice. The Senate sent one Verus to govern a province, but he plundered it instead. A nobleman, Claudius, persuaded a plebeian family to adopt him so he could qualify to run for office as a tribune, a position he used to carry out a plot against the Republic. Cicero and Sallust charged Catiline with gathering reckless former soldiers to burn Rome and frighten creditors into canceling debts. As historian William Leonard put it, it was an age of desperate and bloody self-seeking on the part of the few, while the populace in the city cried now for one leader and now for another, knowing only that it was hungry. And while the yeoman in the Italian fields was run down by disbanded soldiery or bewildered by ever-diminishing returns from his plowing and sowing a depleted soil which he had neither science nor means to restore. In such a world, it is no wonder that a philosopher such as Lucretius would be attracted to the promise of the teachings of the Greek philosopher Epicurus. In the summary of Epicureanism found in the Principal Doctrines, Epicurus wrote that, quote, "A blessed and indestructible being has no trouble himself, and therefore is, quote, free from anger and partiality." Epicurus urged his disciples to withdraw from the public world of competition and conflict into small communities of calm pleasure and languid friendship. Human nature, Lucretius said, yelps after only one thing, quote, that the body be free of pain, the mind enjoy the sense of pleasure far removed from care or fear. His ideal is when friends in the soft grass lie at ease in the shade of a tall tree by the riverside, their bodies refreshed and gladdened. At no great cost, most pleasantly when the weather smiles and the season sprinkles the grassy meadow with new flowers. The connection between Lucretius's tumultuous world and his dreams of peaceful country picnics give us some hint about the man himself. Beyond that, we know almost nothing about him. He died young, at the age of 44. By the time he died, he was an admired poet. Cicero wrote his brother, quote, "The poems of Lucretius are, as you write, they exhibit many flashes of genius and yet show great mastership." And Virgil alludes to the poetry of Lucretius in the second book of his Georgics. An ancient writer informs us that Virgil identified with the older poet because he received his toga virilis, token of his entry into manhood, on the very day that Lucretius died. The church father Jerome provides us with more colorful biographical information. Titus Lucretius the poet is born. Later he was driven mad by a love potion, and when, during the intervals of his insanity, he had written a number of books which were later emended by Cicero, he killed himself by his own hand in the 44th year of his life. Many centuries later, Alfred Lord Tennyson dramatized Lucretius's madness and death in his poem, Lucretius. Finding her husband cold, disappointed when he greets her kisses with small notice and austerity, Lucilla, Lucretius's wife, hires a witch to brew a potion that she slips into his drink. The wicked broth confused the chemic labor of the blood, and ticking the brute brain within the man's, made havoc among those tender cells, and checked his power to shape. Driven mad by the potion, he gives up his legendary calm, and raves about a thunderstorm, about Venus and the gods, and about all that his philosophy was designed to protect him against, until he drove the knife into his side. She heard him raging, heard him fall, ran in, beat breast, tore hair, cried out upon herself, as having failed in duty to him, shrieked that she but meant to win him back, fell on him, clasped, kissed him, wailed. Lucretius recovers himself enough to warn his wife not to sorrow over death. "Care not thou thy duty? What is duty? Fare thee well." Unfortunately, this dramatic story is probably not true. We have no more idea about how Lucretius died than we do about how he lived. Significance. Tennyson was not the only Victorian to take note of Lucretius. Of On the Nature of Things, Thomas Babington Macaulay commented that the philosophy is for the most part utterly worthless, but in energy, perspicuity, variety of illustration, knowledge of life and manners, talent for description, sense of the beauty of the external world, and elevation and dignity of moral feeling, he had hardly ever an equal. Lucretius was interesting to Victorians partly because he seemed so contemporary. Matthew Arnold noted that depression and ennui, boredom, the characteristic stamped on how many of the representative works of modern times, were also the characteristics stamped on the poem of Lucretius. 19th century scientists were intrigued by Lucretius's scientific theories, which seemed to anticipate their own. As we shall see, he developed an early form of atom theory, and his description of the origin of the universe sounded familiar to readers of Darwin's Origin of Species. In the 20th century, the Spanish philosopher George Santayana ranked Lucretius with Dante and Goethe as great philosophical poets. Lucretius was also influential in earlier centuries. In his treatise about the origin of the state, Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes famously described man's life in the state of nature as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He could have been quoting Lucretius. For many revolutions of the sun, they, early humans, led the life of the pack, like beasts that roam. There was no ruddy farmer to steady the plow. Unknown were iron tools to till the fields, how to plant out new shoots, or from tall trees prune away the old branches with the hook. They had no foundry skills, no use for fire. They didn't know how to clothe themselves with skins, but lived in the wild woods and the mountain caves, stowing their dirt-rough limbs among the bushes. When driven to flee, the wind's lash and the downpour. There was no society to speak of. Quote, they could not recognize the common good. They knew no binding customs, used no laws. They were motivated by a need for survival and by primitive desires for sex and food. They slept naked in a thatch of leaves and branches, fearing the night. Their life, like their diet, was hard, but ample for wretches born to die. Hobbes's treatise provided a rationale for absolutist states, and to that Lucretius made his unattended contribution. The greatest of Lucretius's disciples was Virgil himself. Anthony Esselin, a recent translator of On the Nature of Things, suggests that the most important intellectual and poetic influence upon Virgil was neither Homer nor Homer's Roman admirer Aeneas, but Lucretius. Virgil was steeped in Lucretius, but he resisted Lucretius's influence. Esselin writes, Lucretius excited and disturbed Virgil, as I think he did most of the poets of the early empire, and, much later, the poets of the Renaissance. By Virgil's day, it had become impossible for a sophisticated person to believe all the myths of the Greek and Roman gods. But Virgil longed for some divinity in things, some plan or fate that men had to obey and that would justify Rome's dominance in the world. Lucretius posed a serious problem for him. On the one hand, he understood both Lucretius's love of nature and his desire to reveal how the universe works. On the other hand, there were some strains in Lucretius which stirred Virgil to intellectual struggle. The emphasis on chance, the retreat from the political, the utter disdain for war, the meaninglessness of history. Summary and setting. Lucretius's goal is to explain how the world works. He starts by describing the basic building blocks of the world, atoms and empty space, then describes human nature, knowledge, and sensation, and ends with an overview of the origins of the universe, development of the human race, and wonders in heaven, like thunder and lightning, and on earth, earthquakes, volcanoes, and magnetism among them. The 6 books of Lucretius's poem can be divided into 3 sets of 2 books. Books 1 to 2 start on the microscopic scale with atoms. Books 3 to 4 move up the scale to human nature, and the final 2 books deal with the world in its totality. At the same time, the poem can be divided in half. Book 1 begins with a song to Venus, Lucretius's name for nature, that brings all things to life, causes the winds and storms to move across the sky, and makes plants spring from the ground and the ocean waves surge. And the first half of the poem ends with a reminder that life leads inevitably to death. This much is sure. The end of life awaits us. The summons must be answered. We must die. And long life won't allow us to pluck out one moment from our span beyond the grave, that we might spend a shorter time in death. In short, eternal death awaits. The second half of the poem moves through the same cycle. With the help of the muses, Lucretius claims to be singing to bring dark matters into the light, so that his readers can grasp the entire nature of things. He is the singer of life. But if you thought the end of Book 3 was grim, it is nothing compared to the end of the poem as a whole, a long and painful description of a plague in Athens. All was chaos, fear, and every man had his own buried as his means allowed. The suddenness and poverty incited horrors. On funeral pyres, heaped up for others, people would lay their own kin down and wail, and set their torches underneath, and sometimes brawl and shed blood rather than leave their dead. Wow. A number of the individual books in the poem have the same shape. Book 2, for instance, begins with a famous passage in which Lucretius reflects on the sweetness of watching from a distant shore as the ship struggles against the waves. Your freedom from those troubles is what's sweet, he remarks, but the sweetness is no longer there at the end, as he portrays an old plowman who sees that all of his hard work has come to nothing, and complains that the world has gotten worse since the days of his fathers, but doesn't grasp that slowly, fast, wasting away all things, go to the tomb, worn out by the long years. Each book begins in life and ends in death. Each acknowledges Venus, the creatress, and Venus, the destroyer. The exception is Book 5, which celebrates the achievement of human beings throughout. Macaulay believed the poem was unfinished, and many others have agreed, but the overall pattern matches the pattern of each book and makes it likely that the poem ends exactly where Lucretius meant it to end, with a disturbing reminder of the grave. In this, too, Lucretius may have influenced Virgil, who ends the Aeneid not with a celebration of the grandeur of Rome, but with the shade of Turnus howling toward hell. Worldview. Many students are put off by poetry. Even more are put off by philosophy. Homer's poetry is redeemed by the story and the gore. Swords crashing through brain pans, seductive sirens, a heated olive wood pole sizzling in the eye juice of a cyclops. Lucretius has something to annoy both types of students. On the Nature of Things is a philosophical poem. It may seem the worst of all worlds. That's not the way Lucretius saw it. He chose to write philosophy in poetic form because he thought the poetry would sweeten the hard philosophical truth that he wanted to teach. He is a physician of souls, and just as doctors try to coax children to take foul wormwood by brushing the rim of the cups all around with the sweet and golden juice of honey, so Lucretius reveals the harsh teaching of Epicurus in sweet-throated song, touching it with the honey of the muses. Philosophy might sound rather boring, and all his talk of death might even be a little frightening. But Lucretius spices up his philosophy with delightful observations on nature, satire on human follies, accounts of wars and illness. Lucretius loves the world and the things of the world, and he helps us see things that we would often ignore. Unlike some other philosophers who are so obsessed with unseen realities that they miss what they do see, Lucretius keeps taking us back to ordinary life. As Esalen says, there are the boys spinning around and making themselves so dizzy they think the roofs are about to tumble on them. Snakeskins dangling from the briars, the yelp of a dog when she licks her puppies, and the different yelp when she slinks away from a beating. The applause of a rooster's wings, the shimmering blue and coral plumage that rings the throat of a dove. Homer is the master of mayhem, but the pacifist, Lucretius, can be nearly as good. Fighters fall where they are stricken. The blood spurts in the direction from which we suffer the hit. In hand-to-hand combat, the red gush strafes the enemy. Men have tried nearly everything to gain advantage in battle, sometimes unleashing lions on their enemies, which go lunging for the attacker's face, or ripping the unsuspecting from behind, clamping them, mortally wounded, to the ground, and fixing them fast with healthy bites and claws. Sometimes his descriptions of war are metaphorical. Elsewhere, he describes the frenzied movement of atoms as a microscopic battle. Few satirists in history have captured better than Lucretius the pathetic puppyism of a lover who transforms his beloved's every blemish into a thing of rare beauty. Men laugh at a fellow who's stuck with an ugly girlfriend. You better go keep your Venus happy, fool. Their own troubles are worse, and they can't see them. She's black as soot, honey tan. She never washes, casual. Cat-eyed, like Pallas. She's knobby and wiry, a gazelle. A dwarf's ma petite, my little charmer. A big bruiser's one who'll take your breath away. The stammerer's lisps, the stock still. She's just bashful. While the spiteful little spitfire's a real sparkler. It's svelte for a woman too withered to keep alive, and the half-dead hacker's got a delicate frame. I could go on forever with such stuff, Lucretius says, and he probably could. But he's more interested in reminding the infatuated, hey, there are others. On the nature of things is philosophy, and it talks about hidden things. Unlike Plato's, though, it is philosophy that starts from the world as we know it and keeps returning us to that world. Lucretius's main aim is ethical. He wants to teach people how to live well, and in his mind, living well means being liberated from care, anxiety, and fear. As he looks around him and reviews history, he sees two main things that cause fear: religion and death. We are overly serious and anxious about life because we fear that the gods will punish us if we slip up. Fear of death stirs us to care in many ways because we recoil from the empty blankness of death, because the shortness of life makes us fear that we will never accomplish all we want to accomplish, because our limited time and limited resources prick us to competition for fame and far more money than we can ever use. If we can be liberated from religion and the fear of death, we can live without fear. And if we can live without fear, we can be truly happy. The contemporary atheist, Christopher Hitchens, is updating an argument from Lucretius when he claims that religion poisons everything. Lucretius takes a roundabout way to make his point. Instead of simply exhorting the readers, fear not, he gives an account on the nature of things that makes fear and care seem absurd. All his discussions of science, of the nature of reality, of knowledge, are designed to show two things. First, he wants to show that reason can explain the world without having to call in the gods to fill in the gaps. If he can explain thunder as an effect of atoms bumping into each other, then thunder is no longer the voice of Jupiter. If he can explain earthquakes as natural phenomena, then he relieves us of the fear that an earthquake is punishment from the gods. Gods exist, Lucretius believes, but they live in an eternal state of bliss and couldn't care less about our world. Best to return the favor and ignore them. Second, he aims to show that death is the natural course of all things. It is no more to be feared than a flower petal, or spring, or a butterfly dipping his proboscis into a flower. It is just as natural as an avalanche or a tsunami. We ought no more grieve at death than we grieve over sunsets. According to Lucretius, the world consists of essentially two realities. On the one hand, there are atoms. Atoms are the smallest bits of matter, so small that they are invisible in themselves. Esalen sometimes translates the word atom as first beginning, since the atoms that make up a thing are like seeds that make the thing grow into a particular kind of thing. Atoms have only a few properties of their own. They come in a variety of sizes and a variety of shapes, and they move at different speeds. They have no accidental qualities like color or taste. These properties emerge only when atoms assemble into things like iron and seawater and stars. There are an infinite number of atoms, but a finite number of different types of atoms. Everything that we experience in the world is a conglomeration of atoms of different sizes and shapes. Atoms are hard and simple. There is no space within an atom. Beside atoms and surrounding them is empty space, what Lucretius calls the void. Unless there is void, the atoms would have no place to move, and everything would be at a complete standstill, like a late afternoon traffic jam. Even apparently solid objects are combinations of atoms and void. As Lucretius summarizes his point, the universe is made up of two things, which exist in themselves, atoms and void. And there is no third thing that helps compose the world. No wonder modern writers have been intrigued by Lucretius. He seems to have hit upon the scientific view that the world consists of nothing but matter in motion. Lucretius attempts to explain virtually everything in terms of these two fundamental realities. Why are some objects heavier and more solid than others? Because the atoms are packed together more tightly. Iron has less void than water. Why are some objects smooth and others rough? Because they have atoms of different shapes. Why are liquids so liquidy? Because they have smooth, round atoms. Why does air move faster than lava? Because its atoms are smaller, lighter, and faster. Why is my shovel handle narrower at the place where I grip it? Because it's losing atoms. Why do trees grow? Because they're gaining them. He, Lucretius, explains our experience of the world through the senses in the same way. Why are some liquids bitter? Because they contain sharp-edged atoms, while more pleasant liquids are made of round atoms that slip down the gullet without getting caught. Why do sounds travel through doors when sights cannot? Because the atoms of sound are smaller and can fit through the gaps in the door, while vision atoms are larger and get stuck. Given his ignorance of chemistry, shared by everyone in the ancient world, Lucretius's atomic theory is childishly physical, but it is no less ingenious for that. Though Lucretius says that the universe consists of atoms and void, he finds that he cannot do without a few other forces. The world is not random, but why not? What keeps atoms from combining in any old way, constantly generating dog heads and centaurs, liquid flowers with trees, and trees with eyes and eyebrows? What makes atoms stick together in the first place? How can Lucretius explain the reality of kinds? When a lion mates with his lady, why do the atoms form into another lion instead of a pomegranate? Lucretius gives several answers to these questions. At times, he attributes the regularity of the world to nature or creating nature, sometimes personified as Venus. She forces the atoms to be bounded by void and to bound the void in turn. By alternating these, she gives the world endlessness. If they do not bound each other, one of them in pure form would stretch forever. To answer the question about kinds, he speaks of laws in the universe. Don't suppose atoms link in every way, for if they did, we would meet freaks and monsters on every street corner. Things grow into kinds because they must. A fixed law makes it so. He explains, for the atoms proper to each, from the right food, stream into the limbs and, linking, bring about suitable motion. By contrast, we see nature shed to earth the foreign stuff, and much the body will expel with unseen blows, atoms that cannot link up or replicate the inner motions and the bonds of life. So there are atoms, there is void, and there is some force or power which keeps things together and guides the atoms to combine in a finite number of ways. Like his teacher, the godlike Epicurus, Lucretius believes that we can trust our senses. When I see an iguana, there is actually an iguana there. Lucretius attempts to explain the reliability of sense in terms of his atomic theory. Thin sheets, very thin sheets of very, very tiny atoms are constantly peeling off and floating away from things. Floating, mind you, in the exact shape of the thing and in every direction at once. These wraith-like semblances or films enter our eyes and, quote, strike our minds when we're awake and give us the sensation of seeing. For Lucretius, all senses are a form of touch, the film of atoms banging into the atoms of our eyes. Lucretius runs into a problem here. He does not think our senses ever deceive us. Rather, deception arises from misinterpretation of what our senses receive from these shimmering drapes of atoms that come from things. As Esselin points out, this does not solve the problem. Since for Lucretius, thought itself is a kind of sight. Quote, we see films thick enough for the eye, but we think films so thin that only the soul can notice them. But then, can the eye of the soul be deceived? If so, why can't the physical eye? Lucretius wants to say that all our thought comes from information provided by the senses, but it gets tangled up in contradictions. Besides, Esselin says, Lucretius leaves the mind passive, but when we think it feels active-willed, creative. Lucretius has no account of memory or logic or imagination. The problems that Lucretius runs into with knowledge and the mind are evident also in his attempt to explain the soul within his atomist theory. The soul is, like everything else, a body composed of atoms, though soul atoms are, of course, an extremely fine, silky kind of atom. Quote, "The soul is super subtle, composed of tiniest particles. They are so fine and small, in fact, that their presence cannot be detected. Bodies don't get lighter when the soul and mind leave." This is a central part of Lucretius's argument. If he can prove that the soul simply passes out of existence along with the body at death, then he can relieve fears of hell or the uncertainties of a life beyond death. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. Genesis 1, 3, and 4. This is a detail from the Sistine Chapel ceiling painted by Michelangelo between 1508 and 1512. But he, Lucretius, can't quite stay true to his atomism here. A thoroughly atomistic theory in which atoms and void were absolutely the only things about could not explain our experience of free will, our experience of mental resistance to outside forces. As many moderns have concluded, if we are nothing more than atoms randomly assembled, then the idea that we can will, desire, think, plan, remember, reason is nonsense. What we think we experience as will is only the random jostling of atoms, genes, and whatnot. When we think that we are resisting the influence of the world outside, we are actually just doing what our atoms and genes and chemical reactions make us do. Lucretius does not have the courage of his atomism because he knows that his heart has a power of its own that cannot be reduced to atoms and void. When someone physically coerces us, quote, "How patently clear that all our body's atoms are then dragged, kidnapped, going in spite of us, till through the limbs the will bridles them in. So you see that although an outside force can push many men forward against their will and drag them or pitch them headlong, still in our hearts there is something which can stand up to block it, fight it, at whose decision to multitude of atoms we meanwhile spurred in the joints and the limbs to turn and be reined in from the gallop and stand still." Lucretius can explain this only by changing his theory. Atoms have some unexplained power beyond collision and weight, a power of motion that gives our hearts an inborn power to resist. This is one implication of the Epicurean doctrine of the swerve, a random variation, a tilt in the motion of an atom. On the slender thread of an atomic swerve rests all the interior life of the soul that is so much a part of being human. This is not the only difficulty in Lucretius's theory. He attempts to explain the nature of things by rational explanation without appeal to divine forces. Yet, to make it work, the atoms have to have remarkable attributes. They are eternal, indestructible, simple, just like God. As the Dutch theologian Herman Bavinck observed a century ago, at the atomic level, matter simply takes on very non-material qualities, for none of the material things we know are eternal, indestructible, or simple. The smaller the bit of matter, it seems, the closer it resembles spirit. Further, Estlin points out that Lucretius shoots himself in the foot by trying to urge moderation without religion. Quote, the traditional moderator has been religion itself, which in Lucretius's own words clamps its bit in our mouths and reins us in. But if religion does not bridle us, what will? Conclusion. For all its flaws, On the Nature of Things isolates a key problem in human life, namely, the fear of death. The New Testament is in agreement with Lucretius at this point. Fear of death enslaves and inhibits the fullness of human life. Instead of the Epicurean resignation to death, however, the New Testament announces Jesus' triumph over death through his resurrection, a triumph that translates death itself into a way to life. As much as Lucretius, the New Testament teaches us to overcome fear, but it dispels fear of death by inculcating another fear, the fear of God, the fear of Yahweh. That is the beginning of wisdom. By Peter J. Lightheart.